Okay, welcome to this podcast entitled Subdivision. The recording will go for about 15 minutes and we'll be talking about how new lots can be created from an original lot. That is freehold title we're talking about here. So you have a fee simple piece of land and you wish to create multiple interests in that land for other owners. So you can think of things like townhouses, apartment complexes, and even two freestanding houses next door to one another, which frequently happens in the city, Brisbane, for example, these days. So we're going to talk about the process of subdivision, just as a broad overview. This is not a planning course, so you don't need to know too much about the planning provisions, but you do need to know that there is a process. You do need to know about these things called plans. Plans of subdivision, and hopefully you enjoy this recording. So what is subdivision? Well, basically what it sounds like. So you've got a freehold lot, right, a piece of land, and so look at that picture on the left, for example, and that's a house. So that might be one lot, but in the second picture you want to create multiple lots from that one lot. So for example, you're a developer, you want to make plenty of money, so what you do is you buy the lot, and subject to planning approval, you can create additional lots on that one lot. In other words, smaller ones. So if you look at the middle picture, you'll see it's an apartment building. There are probably let's just say there's two apartments on each level. That's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So 10 in there, and there's probably 10 in there. So that makes 20. So that makes 20 individual lots, for our example. Whereas once upon a time, it might have just been one lot. There might have been a house on there, or it may not have been. So what we're talking about here is subdividing not only the ground, right, but we're talking subdivision into the airspace as well. And in the third picture here, you can see townhouses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So in that case, they've subdivided on the land. They haven't necessarily created lots into airspace, because you remember back to that famous case of Bernstein and Skyviews, that you have rights, lot owners or landowners have rights as is reasonably necessary into the airspace. So you don't need to do that for those. You don't need to limit it, the height for those. Although the buildings are probably limited by way of planning approval, but the creation of the lots is another example of subdivision. So you might have had one single lot there. It's now become 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 individual lots, which can be owned by separate people. So there's another graphical representation of what I've been talking about. Here you've got the original lot on the right-hand side, and that is obviously subdivided, that is carved up into separate lots. They can be in the airspace, in the case of apartment buildings, commercial buildings. Alternatively, they could be on the land only, such as these types of examples with townhouses, or they could be freestanding houses on each individual lot. So you need to be aware, even though you don't need to know a lot about the Planning Act for this course, or don't know any of the individual sections of the Act for this course, you do need to know that subdivision is a process which is covered by the Planning Act. So remember, we're talking about the doctrine of tenure of estates, and the idea that, well, a person does own land, and for all practical purposes it is their land. However, it's granted to them or allocated to them by the state from a statutory power that the state has. So in other words, the state can amend the rights that a private owner has, or limit them or restrict them. So for example, in land clearing, they could also do so in the context of subdivision. So they could say, yes, you can subdivide, or no, you can't subdivide. So here we've got a situation of the Queensland Planning Act, so this is state level legislation, is calling the process of subdivision the reconfiguration of a lot, or reconfiguring a lot, which essentially includes subdivision, but also includes these other things here. So that comes from Schedule 2 of the Planning Act. Before the Planning Act, we had something called the Sustainable Planning Act, 2009, and before that there was the Integrated Planning Act, 1997. So you can see we've had multiple incarnations of planning legislation. Before that, there was local government and planning restrictions as well. Basically controlling what people can do with their land, and one of those things that they do might be subdivision. Then what happens with the process of subdivision is that the state government will tell the local governments, you need to have what are called planning instruments. So these instruments are essentially plans, long-term plans for how that local government area, and in this case I've got the city of Brisbane, is going to manage its urban and rural development going forward, and coastal, if you're a coastal council as well. So just pick this example because we're living in Brisbane, QT is located in Brisbane. The Brisbane City Plan is the plan for the Brisbane local government area, and they've got a subdivision code. So that code sets out how, to what extent you can subdivide a lot. It's quite detailed, you need to know all that. You just need to know the general overview that what it's saying is if you wanted to subdivide a lot, you're going to need the permission of the Brisbane City Council, and that permission, whether they grant it or not, they're going to be looking against this code. Now you see some terms there that say accessible development and impact accessible development. Those terms essentially come from the planning legislation at the state level, in the case of reconfiguring a lot, so subdividing a lot, it's likely to be impact accessible. Which essentially means that it's going to go out for public consultation. Code accessible, on the other hand, literally just means we're just going to look at the code. We're not going to publicly advertise this, and we'll make a decision on whether your subdivision can go through. So in all of this, we need to come across some terminology which we need to understand. Here is an example of a plan. So I'm just trying to develop your understanding of the concept of subdivision further. And you recall that back in, well, it's called the Middle Ages, the English system, doctrine of tenure, was inherited from feudal Europe, right, from France. And how it was thought to operate was that the Crown became the absolute beneficial owner of all land and granted or alienated or allocated particular parcels of land or interests in land to its subjects, i.e. us. Those individual lot owners then could deal with that lot as a fee. If it was a fee simple, they could sell it and they could hand it down through generations. And then in Australia, we had that concept of crown leasehold emerge. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that we had a system, we inherited that system, subject of course to native title, which you've now hopefully understood the differences between the English and the Australian system of tenure. But whereas the tenure relationship is talking about the creation of lots from the state to the subject, the subdivision relationship is talking about the creation of multiple lots from a single fee simple owner. So in this situation, we might have had one original lot, let's just say it consumed all these 5 lots, given to, let's call her Serena Smith. And Serena decides that she's going to subdivide this property, and these look like they could be, what, townhouses or something. They've got walls between them, they're pretty much similar. And they've got some common property, which we'll talk about in a second. So what she's done is applied for subdivision. You can see the creation of 5 separate lots there that originally would have come from one lot. So what this is called the plan. So you can see up here RP225558. This means registered plan. So the plan has been registered, that is recorded with the land registry. You might have come across that discussion of the land registry so far in this course, but rest assured we'll be talking about it a bit more as we go on in the course, particularly when we get to the following week about times. But for now, you can just understand that this is a plan, is essentially a map. It's a document which shows the boundaries to the individual lots. And in the case of subdivision, multiple lots can be created and their boundaries identified through the lodgement of a plan, which is done by obviously a registered surveyor, is the profession that does those. So when the plan is registered, and you've seen this document before, this is the title search which I've shown you in previous podcasts, you can see that, let's just assume this is, what did I call her? Serena Smith. So she's the registered owner of lot 3, so this one here, on registered plan 270472. Okay, obviously I've got a different number here, but just assume that those two are the same numbers, right? So that registered plan is referring to this diagrammatic representation, and that's lot is referring to her lot on that plan. Obviously, in this case, we had tenants in common, but remember from the previous podcast, we're talking about co-ownership is also, it could be joint tenants, and if it was, there'd be no separate interests there. They would just be because they're held jointly. Right, so that's how it would come up on an individual title search. So back to this process of subdivision. If you're going to subdivide land, you need to comply with the legislation. And the relevant legislation here is two pieces of legislation. The one I will talk about in this podcast is the Land Title Act, and these provisions, where are we here? Sections 48A down to probably down to 49DA. You don't need to know them all off by heart, but just be aware that the available formats for plans, that is the different types of plans or diagrammatic representations that you can lodge in order to create that subdivision, are regulated under the Land Title Act. So there are three options for a developer. There's a standard format plan, there's a building format plan, and there's a volumetric format plan. So you can see them here. So the standard format plan is essentially used for things like a townhouse complex or where you have two houses side by side. So the surveyor comes out, it identifies the land by using a horizontal plane. So we're just talking about physical land that you can see in front of you on the ground, and marks on that ground. So we'll put a stake, as you can see commonly down the bottom. You might have seen some of these that are still left in houses on the boundaries to identify the boundaries of that land. The second example, or the second type of plan you could use is a building format plan. Now that will identify not only the boundaries here, right, the physical boundaries of the structure itself, but also these individual lots, because remember, this used to be one lot. It is now, what did we say, about 20 lots, right? So someone can own this apartment, someone can own this apartment, someone can own this one, someone can own this one. So the plan that's used to create this subdivision needs to be able to show things like the floors, and that'll be the differentiation point between this lot and that lot, and there'll be a ceiling there, it'll be their floor, and it will also differentiate this lot owner from that one, and so on and so forth. So these are used, for example, in multi-story unit complexes. Final one, which I'm going to introduce you to, is called a volumetric format plan. So here you've got essentially the subdivision of an original piece of land, but you want to be able to divide, the developer wants to be able to divide the lots into the airspace, as they did in the previous one, but also beneath the ground. So they might want to create a car park. So it's not possible to use physical marks on the ground. And also you're dealing with the concept of airspace and also land beneath the soil beneath the land. So you need to be able to draw things isometrically or via what they call here three-dimensionally located points. So you might have 1, 2, 3 as your points, and be able to section off or identify individual lots. in that complex which you would like to register, meaning that if I was a developer, I'd come in, I own this entire lot, I then say I want to subdivide it, and I want to register a volumetric format plan. My plan will identify the individual lots in that building. Right, so there could be apartment here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And in addition, it could also have a car space beneath. So it's quite helpful for identifying how you're trying to explain the boundaries to where lot ownership begins and ends in a subdivided property. So you can see there, we might also have something in the property which shows common property. So the lift, for example, might be common property that is not owned individually by a unit holder, a lot holder in the complex, but is owned communally, in a co-ownership way, as we talked about co-ownership before. So very similar concept by all the lot owners in that subdivided building. So you can see there, volumetric could be used to show that common property, the lift, and also the car park beneath. So that's it. It was really just an introduction to show you that land can be subdivided. You need to know that there's generally a process which will be restricted by, or which will be controlled by Queensland's planning laws, which is the Planning Act. That Planning Act will require development approval, most likely. There could be approvals, for example, for demolishing the building. There could be an additional approval for the construction of a multi-storey complex. That multi-storey complex, in order to create that subdivision and all those new lots, you would need to register a plan and use one of those plans, most likely the building format plan or the volumetric format plan, and that'll show the boundaries of where the new lots can exist. Then that plan becomes registered if it's a land registry. Don't worry too much about the registry system. We'll talk about that in the coming weeks. It will show up on a title search. And the last point I made there was simply about the plan can also show things like common property. For example, the lifts and foyers and car parks and things like that. Right, so I hope you can conceptually understand that. We'll move on in the next podcast to talk more specifically about community titles and the legislation around that.